Thank you very much, Felicity. It's lovely.
Just at the moment we needed to hear the sound. Issues there with the connection to central London. Lord Cameron, you can just see, taken to the podium. We'll work to try and re-establish that connection as soon as we can. But like I say, Lord Cameron giving an address as what's been described as a landmark speech on UK security. He is due to say, and probably is saying, that the UK needs to adopt a harder edge for a tougher world. That's responding to global challenges such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine and also Houthi attacks in the Red Sea. And those Houthi attacks are part of what's being described as an axis of resistance following Israel's conflict with Hamas in Gaza. We've seen Iranian-backed militias such as the Houthis and also Hezbollah in Lebanon launching attacks on not just Israel, but also other nations who they say are linked to the situation. Let's dip back now into central London and the Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron. Let's re-establish that audio.
We cannot divorce foreign policy from economic performance. Investing more overseas requires Today, it is transformed, and that's thanks to our drive to secure Malaysian investment and offer determined government support. Hundreds of offices and flats, shops and restaurants now sit beneath those towers, and it demonstrates our continued attractiveness to overseas investors. But nor can we divorce foreign and economic policy from domestic politics. All over the the rise of political movements that want us to put up the drawbridge, claiming that we'll be better off if we focus purely on domestic concerns. Now, I believe these movements are profoundly wrong, not just because Britain is an outward-facing nation, with almost 1 in 10 of us living abroad, and a set of interests and connections that are truly global, but because what happens abroad matters directly to our citizens. However, our approach must not be to ignore the rise of these movements. It must be to deal with what has caused them to grow, so we can engage with the world and therefore safeguard our national interests. And I believe the two biggest drivers are clear. One, failing to control borders properly and tackle illegal immigration. And second, leaving too many people and too many places behind, cut off from the uneven benefits of globalization. Any political party that fails to address these drivers will find itself incapable of governing effectively and getting things done. That's why we're fixing our immigration system, breaking the business model of smuggling gangs, and that the whole country shares in the benefits of long-term growth. Now, the role of the Foreign Secretary is not separate from this responsibility, it is integral to it. Ultimately, what guides everything I do as Foreign Secretary is Britain's prosperity and Britain's security. Earlier this year, I returned to the Berlin Wall, and I remember the days of its fall as if it was yesterday. Visiting Germany with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation, meeting dissidents who had kept the flame of freedom alive behind the Iron Curtain, hacking off a chunk of the wall, a piece of history for myself, together with travelling in the Soviet Union between school and university. These were defining events in my political development. As the era of state socialism was crumbling, that sense of optimism, of possibility, was infectious. And contrast that with today. War in the heart of Europe, from Tallinn to Warsaw, Prague to Bucharest, a chill has once more descended across the European continent. Those nations closest to Russia, seeing what is happening in Ukraine, and wondering if they will be next. And not far from Europe, war rages in the Middle East, as Israel seeks to defend itself and bring the hostages home, while innocent citizens in Gaza endure a crisis that will only worsen if aid cannot reach them safely. All this while there are at least 18 conflicts underway in Africa. This is a world more dangerous, more volatile, more confrontational than most of us have ever known. And we need to face up to that fact and act accordingly. Not in a year or two, not in a few months, but now. The courage to act. Returning to frontline politics, what stands out to me is how many reasons are found for us not to act. It too often feels as if the fundamental change in the world has not yet been met with a fundamental change in how many in the free world are thinking and acting. Both in Britain and in the wider world, there are too many who adopt a kind of defensive crouch. Not just those I've already mentioned who want to put up the drawbridge, but also those who think we can't act, claiming we've become too weak, not powerful enough militarily or effective enough economically. Or those who won't act, so fixated are they on the risks, be they of escalation, unintended consequences, legal jeopardy, or simply causing offence. Fear of making the wrong choice leads to another meeting or another strategy paper, even when not acting is actually the worst choice of all. All of this, while, as the Prime Minister said in Warsaw recently, an axis of authoritarian states like Russia, Iran, North Korea and China is increasingly acting together in an attempt to undermine us and our allies and the world order on which we depend. My conviction is that we, with our partners, can choose to make a difference. Entering politics in the 1980s, it was not at all obvious how or when the West would prevail over the Soviet Union. Some urged us to reduce our defences or abandon the nuclear deterrent, but we stood firm and it worked. Similarly, towards the end of my time as Prime Minister, it was not obvious that we could defeat Daesh. Some declared that an Islamic State in control of vast swathes of Iraq and the Levant was here to stay, that an intervention would only see us bogged down in the Middle East. But together with our friends and allies, we drove their so-called caliphate right back. We in Britain and in the wider West, we have agency. The question is whether we have the courage to use it, the courage to act. So how then should we act? I see 6 points which really matter if we're to rise to the challenges that we face. First, we need to make security our top priority. If you want a picture of the dangers in the world, you can actually look right here at home in the last few months. Attacks on our democracy from China, including spying on the Electoral Commission and cyber targeting of our members of Parliament. Reminders of the wide-ranging covert Russian playbook, including a suspected sabotage attack on a warehouse in East London just last week. And as the Director General of MI5 has made, numerous Iranian plots to assassinate British or UK-based individuals perceived as enemies of their regime. Again, right here in the UK. As Prime Minister, I was proud to host the 2014 NATO summit in Wales, at which allies committed to spend at least 2% of GDP on defence. And I'm proud to speak here today at the National Cyber Security Centre, which we set up to make Britain the safest place to live and work online. Today, as the threat has grown and evolved, we in government need to do even more to prioritise security. And so we have passed the National Security Act and a new Investigatory Powers Act so we can defend ourselves against espionage more effectively. We've introduced the National Security Investment Act so we can screen investment into our critical national infrastructure. We've prepared the Foreign Interest Registration Scheme so we can bolster our resilience here in Britain against covert foreign influence. And, crucially, the Prime Minister has committed to spend 2.5% of GDP on defence, the biggest investment in defence for a generation. And defence research and development will get at least 5% of the defence budget, so we stay at the cutting edge of defence technology. It is vital we sustain this focus on security, doing whatever is required to harden our defences. Second, we need to be bolder in standing up for what we believe in. The national interest defines our foreign policy. Some try to portray this as somehow unprincipled, as if by putting the national interest first, we will sacrifice important values. I think nothing could be further from the truth. It is profoundly in our national interest to defend those core beliefs: freedom, the rule of law, respect for human rights and human dignity, and to defend the core principles of an open international order: right, not might, sovereignty and territorial integrity, freedom of navigation. These principles are not some mere abstractions, words solemnly proclaimed in the UN Charter, Sustainable Development Goals, or other international agreements. Rather, they are vital foundations for British and global security and prosperity. All of the world's citizens benefit when these freedoms are upheld, sovereignty is respected, and commerce flows freely around the globe. So we, our allies and our partners, must stand up and defend them. Our adversaries openly challenge these principles. They have no qualms at distortions and even outright lies in the media, and they use new tools and techniques to distract and mislead. We must be bolder in combating their poisonous methods of deceit. That's what Britain and America did by publicising our intelligence before Putin's illegal invasion. It was an unprecedented step, and it made absolutely clear what Putin was planning to do: assault a neighbour without a scrap of justification. We in the West need to undermine and expose the malign networks that Russia uses to spread its lies. Over the last 5 years, Britain's invested over £600 million in this effort, funding the BBC World Service, which reaches over 300 million listeners each week, backing free media and the free flow of information, supporting independent journalism in places like Moldova and Bosnia, where Russia seeks to bully and bribe their way to manipulate the media and undermining politics. Our adversaries also strive to undermine global trust in these beliefs and principles by attacking our own record. They gleefully accuse the West of double standards. And I think we should be frank in our response. Yes, the suffering in Gaza is appalling, but an unprovoked war against an independent country like Ukraine that poses no threat is wholly different from the conflict that has grown from the brutal attacks of October the 7th. And in each case, we are consistently pursuing the fastest route to sustainable peace consistent with the principles of the UN Charter. Every country in the world actually cares about principles like sovereignty and territorial integrity. And of course, our adversaries say that we didn't invest in the global south. Nonsense. It is the West who's funding the key parts of the global system, doing the most to tackle poverty and improve lives of people around the world. How much does Moscow give to the UN Central Emergency Relief Fund? Well, actually, 74 times less than Britain's contribution. How much does Tehran invest in eradicating malaria? Absolutely zip, nothing to the global fund, which is dedicated to eliminating this killer disease. Britain is the fund's third biggest donor and has played a huge role in developing vaccines now poised to save many more lives. How much does Pyongyang do to protect our oceans? Nothing like Britain's Blue Belt, which is the largest marine protection area in the world, something that benefits not only our country, but our entire planet. And Britain is not alone in such generosity. Our closest partners, large and small, give a huge amount as well. We are faced with a cynical assault on principles and programs which have contributed so much to building a better world. We must fight back and never let that cynicism win. Third point, we need to adopt a harder edge for a tougher world. Pursuing our interests effectively means revisiting approaches to foreign policy, born of good intentions, and ask if they are truly fitting for the world of today. Prizing consensus over action, not speaking out if it might upset others, avoiding risks. Such attitudes perhaps seem to cost us less in a more forgiving age. But if Putin's illegal invasion teaches us anything, it must be that doing too little too late only spurs an aggressor on. And too often this lesson hasn't been learned. Take the Red Sea, where ship after ship from a whole host of countries have been attacked. While many countries have criticised the Houthi attacks, it is actually only the US and Britain that have been willing and able to step up and strike back. Take defence spend in Europe, where still some seem unwilling to invest, even as war rages on our continent. Or take women's rights, where some are so cowed by accusations of neo-colonialism that they will not condemn practices like female genital mutilation, ignoring survivors' calls to eliminate it. This cannot go on. We need to be tougher and more assertive, degrading the Houthis' capabilities, making 2.5% a new benchmark for NATO allies' defence, and using travel bans to stop politicians voting in favour of FGM in the morning and then hopping on a plane to go shopping in London in the afternoon. And sometimes a harder edge means being honest with ourselves, saying, yes, we want to be a country that is ambitious and progressive, but no, we cannot afford to be naive about how best to achieve our goals. So yes, we're open to the world, its people and ideas, but no, we will not permit criminal gangs to decide who can enter our country and undermine voters' trust in our ability to control our borders. By implementing our asylum partnership with Rwanda, we are acting in the national interest. And yes, we're committed to reaching net zero by 2050 and to work globally to support others in meeting their own clean energy ambitions. But no, we will not refuse to grant new licenses in the North Sea for vital oil and gas, nor will we demonise other countries using their own reserves. These things are vital for energy independence from the likes of Putin and part of a responsible energy transition. Again, by taking a proportionate and realistic approach to delivering our climate change goals, we're acting in the national interest. And yes, we support free trade, but no, we're not going to sign a free trade deal just for the sugar rush of the press release. You only get one chance to do these things properly, and it's important to get it right. Via our patient negotiation of trade deals that are real wins, we're acting in the national interest. And yes, again, we believe in free speech and in the freedom to protest. But no, we're not going to shy away from defending democratic values by doing things like updating the definition of extremism to ensure that the government does not legitimise those trying to overturn our democracy. Again, we're acting in the national interest. Now, fourth, we need to have a good dose of realism. In a much more competitive world, Britain must suffer no illusions about our place in it. I'm proud to lead the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office, overseeing a diplomatic network in over 160 countries and a development budget of over £8 billion, not to mention our incredible intelligence and security services. I'm representing, effectively, a nation with a sovereign nuclear deterrent, permanent seat on the UN Security Council, and a web of connections all over the world. But Britain is not a country like the US, whose every decision we make changes the world. There are vital areas where our action is decisive, but often we're a state whose decisions and adept diplomacy can influence the approaches of others. Realism is not defeatism. Having less influence than the global superpower does not mean having no influence at all. While away from frontline politics, I heard a comment by a leading CEO that struck me ever since. Britain, he said, is big enough to matter, but small enough to be nimble. And that seems right to me. He was talking about regulation, but it can apply in so many other contexts. And it is an apt mantra for the modern world in which new powers are emerging, and what matters is building coalitions to get things done. Why does Ukraine call us their number one ally? Not just for the level of our support and the speed at which we delivered it, but it's how we've galvanised others. I vividly recall my experiences in 2014, Imposing even some sanctions on Russia required painstaking negotiation. But gradually, we've made the case for going so much further. We've imposed unprecedented sanctions with our allies. We've provided game-changing kit like long-range missiles and battle tanks with our allies. We've sustained support for Kyiv into a third year of war, once more following the vote in Congress with our allies. And we're now maintaining our military support to Ukraine, £3 billion a year until 2030 and beyond if necessary, and again calling on our allies to join us in that pledge. To persuade, we also need to be active. A fortnight ago, I became the first Foreign Secretary to visit all 5 Central Asian states and Mongolia. In a more contested, more competitive world, Britain needs to get out there and compete. We need to say to potential partners all over the world, if you want to make that choice, to be more open, be more independent, we can help you make that choice. We're fortunate in Britain that English is the world's global language. For young people, speaking English acts as a passport for success, giving an edge in areas like business and finance, law and diplomacy. That is why, for instance, Mongolia, extraordinarily big, bordering Russia and China, has made the extraordinary but brilliant decision to make English their second official language. Ukraine has launched a program so that all their civil servants can learn it. This is a great advantage for Britain, an opportunity to get the world speaking our language in both senses of that phrase. But sometimes we seem almost hesitant to recognise just what a vital tool of influence the English language can be. 60 million people from almost every country in the world use the British Council's free Learn English site. I've expanded the British Council's online teaching offer in Central Asia. And today I can announce a new £1 million programme for the Council to teach English to Ukrainian civil servants. But this should be only the beginning. I believe it should be a core part of our foreign policy and the Foreign Office's mission to lead this global change. We will champion learning the English language around the globe, this year, next year, long into the future. It is a battle which we are winning, and if we turn up and properly fight it, we'll win it faster and better. There's a fifth point, a recognisably British attribute, but which we can sometimes fail to recognise in ourselves, and that is the need to be ruthlessly practical. As was observed about one of my predecessors, Ernest Bevin, he combined, and I quote, a powerful sense of direction, rooted in moral principle, with a streetwise pragmatism in choosing the best route forward. And the result, NATO, speaks for itself. He focused on delivering a strong, united, defensive alliance, rather than hoping a newly formed UN alone would ensure our security. Facing the world as it is, not as it was or as we wish it to be. And so yes, for instance, we want the fighting to end in Gaza, but calling for an immediate ceasefire makes it no more likely. It's much more practical to focus, as we've done, in the UN and elsewhere, with the Israelis, with our partners, on securing that immediate humanitarian pause, that stopping the fighting right now, so we can see hostages released, more aid delivered, and then turn this into the sustainable ceasefire, crucially, without a return to fighting at all. And yes, again, ruthlessly practical, we support multilateral reform because we want the UN and organisations like the WTO and the World Health Organization to succeed, but we're also increasing our support for other, more nimble organisations that can have an incredible impact on the ground, like Gavi, the Global Alliance on Vaccines and Immunisation, or on the Global Fund that does so much brilliant work on diseases. And yes, we've made our biggest ever contribution to the Green Climate Fund to tackle climate change. But we're also trying to make it easier for those small island developing states to access this fund, helping friends across the Caribbean, who I was meeting with yesterday, and friends across the Pacific, like Samoa, host of this year's Commonwealth Summit, to tackle climate change. I could add 2 personal examples of being practical. Yes, I supported remaining in the European Union, but I'm now laser-like focused on ensuring that Britain and the EU have the best possible relationship, not as members, but as friends, neighbours and partners. And I'm doing all I can to ensure Britain invests in new partnerships, such as the CPTPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, a trade deal with one of the fastest growing regions of the world, the Indo-Pacific. And yes, I'm a passionate believer in the power of aid and proud of my role in helping to design the Sustainable Development Goals and boost Britain's aid spending. But with our overseas aid budget under pressure, I'm also proud to have led the department in publishing a groundbreaking international development white paper and pressing for reform of the multilateral development banks and greater cooperation with the private sector so that others can also step up and provide the massive funding that's going to be required to see those SDGs through. Finally, we need to demonstrate political will and strategic patience. It's not enough merely to wish for a better world and hope for the best, nor can we let talk of past failings or present risks paralyse us completely. We in the West need to see things through and see them through together. Our adversaries today know all too well our underlying strengths. They see that the economies of Ukraine and her partners, they outmatch Russia's by around 25 to 1. They can see that Sweden and Finland turn to NATO, an alliance that defends territory, not one that takes territory, at a moment of great uncertainty for those countries. They can see the flow of talented people. They head in our direction, right from across the globe. But they think they've honed in on our greatest weakness. They believe it is they who are more determined to succeed, that they can outlast us, they can endure more pain, they can make more sacrifices. We are in a battle of wills. We all must prove our adversaries wrong, Britain and our allies and partners around the world. We need to outcompete. The upcoming NATO summit must see all allies on track to deliver their pledge made in Wales in 2014 to get to that 2%. And then we need to move quickly to establish 2.5% as the new benchmark. We need to out-cooperate. Investing in old alliances that have served us well, the transatlantic bond, our many friendships in Europe, the Five Eyes partnership, the G7, NATO, the Commonwealth. But we also need to forge new partnerships, like the AUKUS alliance with Australia and the US, the GCAP JET project with Italy and Japan, and the GEF security cooperation with like-minded nations in Northern Europe. And crucially, strengthening our bilateral partnerships with that great mass of countries, such as those in Central Asia I visited last week, who, while they may not be all democratic, they see the destructive reactionary policies of our adversaries as a threat to their security and their prosperity. And we need to out-innovate, using the legal route before us to use frozen Russian assets for the benefit of Ukraine, and leaning into the modern technology that fuels both operations in this building and much of the modern economy, as the Prime Minister did so skillfully by hosting the AI Safety Summit last year. Now, I know from experience it is not straightforward to deliver these points. Dissonant voices press for different paths, easier to tread in the short term, even as they store up problems for years to come. But I'm not disheartened. History is not preordained. I'm often reminded this as Foreign Secretary. Entering my office, I pass portraits of all those predecessors, and the world of today looks very different from that of Bevin and Eden, Grey and Salisbury, Canning and Castlereagh. Yet each faced times of challenge and change. And looking back, one can detect common threads, fundamental traditions in how they acted in response. Prioritising Britain's security, standing up for what they believed in, bringing hard-edged, realistic and practical in their pursuit of the national interest, and demonstrating always political will. The past cannot tell us what to do today, but it can certainly give us some guidance. Today we're being tested yet again, in both foreign and domestic policy, in Britain and the wider West. We are at a crossroads. If we make the right choices, act now, a bright future awaits us. But if we hesitate, our adversaries will write our future for us. So we need to show courage. The courage to determine our own destiny. The courage to rise to this moment of peril. The courage to act. Thank you.
You've been listening there to Lord Cameron, the Foreign Secretary, making a speech in central London. 6 key points he made there, made them in expansive terms, so I shan't repeat those to you. But he did also reference...
Courage to rise to this moment of peril. The courage to act. Thank you. We've got some questions from the press and the wider, I'm going to say, normal people. James Landell from the BBC.
I don't think there's a microphone, so I'll just speak loudly.
I'm sure that's fine, but is there a microphone anywhere?
Speak loudly.
Speak loudly.
Speak loudly. The BBC is reporting this morning that the Saudi government is using lethal force to clear land to build its neon city in the desert. What do you think about this? Is this a good place for you to start with your more courageous, hard-edged foreign policy, where you have the guts to defend British policy and values? And secondly, if I may, now that the Americans are delaying arms sales to Israel because of their concerns about Rafah, will the UK follow suit? And if not, why not?
Okay, thanks. Well, first on Saudi Arabia, I've only just seen that report, so I certainly want to go away and look at it. But yes, fundamentally, Britain has a very strong relationship and partnership with Saudi Arabia. It's in our national interest, and we should have that relationship. I was there only a week ago, discussing with them in detail how do we try and bring peace to Gaza, how do we work on a long-term solution, what role can they play, what role can we play. It's only by being in the room can you have those discussions and lean in and have the courage to act and get things done. But at the same time, if there are issues on human rights or anything else, we don't stand back from raising them, and would do in this case when we get to the bottom of what's being alleged, as we do in others. On the issue of arms and Rafah and everything else, I'll make a number of points. First of all, I think there's a very fundamental difference between the US situation and the UK situation. The US is a massive state supplier of weapons to Israel. We do not have a UK government supply of weapons to Israel. We have a number of licenses, and I think our defence exports to Israel are responsible for significantly less than 1% of their total. So I think that is a big difference. On Rafah, we are clear that we would not support some major operation in Rafah unless there was a very clear plan for how to protect people, save lives, and all the rest of it. We have not seen that plan, and so in these circumstances we would not support a major operation in Rafah. And of course, going back to the arms situation, we have very clear licensing procedures, some of the toughest and most rigorous in the world, and we follow those through very closely, and that's what we are doing and will continue to do in the period ahead. Let's have the lady in the middle.
Lucy Fisher from the Financial Times. Foreign Secretary, you mentioned the government's new foreign influence registration scheme. Should China be on the enhanced here?
Well, I think it's first of all, it's a very good piece of legislation. I think it's very important to have the situation where you can be clear about, as it were, who is working for whom, and I think that is what lies behind it. We're in discussions at the moment about exactly how to introduce it and how to apply it, but I don't think anyone should be in any doubt that we will take a robust approach against those countries that provide the greatest risks. Let's have someone right at the back.
Daniel Tarshish, normal person. You talked about challenging our foreign policy assumptions. What, if anything, do we need to do differently with regard to how we formulate policy and plan specific interventions so that the boldness that you talk about doesn't end up being rashness, particularly because we're going to have to act quickly?
Yeah, that is a great question. I mean, first of all, it's very important to have challenge. Whenever I speak to colleagues in the Foreign Office, FCDO, I invite challenge. I think it's really important that I remember my first experience of sitting around a table. It was with the Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time in the 1990s, and I remember being incredibly refreshed by how the most junior civil servant or special advisor could speak up and challenge and say, don't do this, why are we doing that? I remember there was one particular guy who was particularly outspoken, never seemed to have a cigarette out of his mouth, because that was the days, and was taking on the Chancellor and arguing with him vigorously. It turned out that person was Jeremy Haywood. So that's the finest traditions of the civil service challenge. That's the first thing. Second thing I'd say is there's enormous talent. I can't speak for every department, but I see in my own department when I meet ambassadors and high commissioners and staff in all the different departments, there's huge amounts of talent. I think, though, the one thing where I think we can try and do better as an organisation is, I think analysis is fantastic, I think policy development is very good, but often it's about building programmes. Maybe this is something we can build on the DFID experience in the FCDO, is that analysis and policy takes you so far, but it's actually the programmes and initiatives and following them through and making sure they happen, which I think is somewhere where all government departments can do better, and we're looking at that. But you're right, acting is important, but challenge is important so that you act in the right way, and hopefully we'll get that balance right. Let's have Paul McNamara from Channel 4.
Sorry, my voice won't be quite as booming. President Biden has said that Israel has not yet crossed the red line. What's your red line? Is a ground invasion of Rafah past that red line? And if that does go ahead, what then? What do you do then?
The red line for us, first of all, take a step back, and it's still worth making the point that Israel has a right to exist, a right to defend itself, and as we're sitting here in this lovely, comfortable place, Israel still has over 100 of its citizens, way more than 200 days of being in horrendous captivity, and it's still in a situation where Hamas is still firing rockets into Israel. So it's important to think of that context before we get on to red lines and all the rest of it. That's what they are actually facing as a nation, and they should have our support in trying to deal with that situation. For us, as I say, we're not in the same situation as the US, which are a state arms supplier. We have a number of outstanding licenses that are used for the very small amount of weapons that go from the UK to Israel. Our message to the Israelis is very, very clear, which is, we wouldn't support a major operation in Rafah unless there's a clear plan to protect people and to save lives. We haven't seen that plan, so we wouldn't support the major operation. When it comes to our own arms sales, we have this rigorous process, which the Foreign Secretary is involved in, but the Trade Secretary too, in making sure, crucially, that when we consider export licenses, that we must make sure they're not going to contribute to a serious violation of international humanitarian law. That is the key test, and that's the thing that we apply. So that's the approach we're going to take. Let's have one more from here, and then I'll go to take Jason Groves from the Daily Mail.
Resilience in the context of the changing state architecture. How much of a role do you see resilience having?
I think when we talk about defence and security and protection, I think the whole point is it's going from everything from the defence budget itself all the way through. We harden our own defences, whether that's critical national infrastructure, whether it's safety online, whether it's being able to defend against cyber attacks. And one of the reasons that, a non-scientist, not really clear on all the brilliant things that GCHQ do, was so enthused by the idea of setting up NCSC was that I thought that we've got this amazing jewel in GCHQ, absolutely best, one of the best in the world, alongside the Americans. And do we do enough to try and give it a public face where it can work with society, it can work with business? Because the fact is, someone once said, we are all in this together when it comes to this cyber attacks and all the rest of it. And that's what lay behind NCSC. So, yes, the hardening of our systems is absolutely crucial right across the line. And I think that's what NCSC is about to me, and that's also what all those laws I talked about, national infrastructure, national security, foreign interest registration scheme. If you're living in a harder, more dangerous, more competitive world, fundamentally there are two things you've got to do. One is harden your systems at home, and secondly, get out there and compete overseas. And what I'm trying to say in the sort of 2-second version of the speech, we've got to do both those things. tougher security at home, more engagement overseas, and the two are intimately connected. Because ultimately, an open, trading nation like Britain, we can't succeed in protecting our security or promoting our prosperity unless we're doing the at-home piece, but also the overseas piece, and they're completely linked. Jason Grove.
Thanks. You mentioned the differences in our systems on arms sales, but is Biden wrong to suspend shipments to Israel? Aren't we sending out a message to Tehran and Hamas that we're not willing to finish the job? And actually quickly on defence spending, with some chiding European allies this morning over, I think when you were PM, I think our spending failed. Certainly we haven't got a political consensus here among the main opposition parties. Are we sending a mixed signal to Putin? And do you think this is going to be initiatives on the ballot for the election?
Well, to answer your last question first, I mean, to me, security is definitely on the ballot. If you ask me what's the most important thing we can do right now as a country, it is to enhance our security. That is to spend more on defence, to build up our alliances, to work with our partners, to seek out new allies, to harden our defences at home, to protect ourselves against cybersecurity, to invest in our intelligence services. All of these things are about recognising the world has changed quite fundamentally compared with a decade ago, and the biggest need, in my view, is security. But I would broaden that, because fundamentally, security to me is the most conservative value of all. People care about their financial security, they care about their job security, they care about the security that they have in their lives. And so at this time of international danger, and as I've explained, the international danger isn't just happening over there, it's happening with Russian and Chinese and Iranian attacks here. There's never been a clearer time than to say security is what matters most, and that's what this government is so focused on. On the issue of President Biden, the Americans are in a different situation to us. They are big, government-to-government suppliers of weapons. They're involved deeply in the strategic and tactical conversations that the Israelis are having about how they prosecute this conflict. We have influence, we have agency, we have very frank conversations with the Israelis, but we're not in that same position. Certainly the conversations we're having now are very much around the aid picture, where the Israelis made a lot of promises, about 500 trucks a day, switching on the water, turning back on some of the fuel deliveries, keeping Kerem Shalom opening Ashdod port, fixing this temporary pier off the coast of Gaza. And what I do every day is get together with my team and say, right, where's the list of bottlenecks and how are we doing? Where are we on 500 trucks? Where are we on Kerem Shalom? Where are we on Ashdod? And, today the report was actually better than yesterday's report. We're making some progress. The grain ships got into Ashdod. We're quite close to getting this temporary harbour up and running. Rafah was shut because of the operation. Now it's reopening again, and we're hoping trucks are going to get going again. So we're in a different position. It doesn't mean we have no influence, but it means we use our influence in two ways. One, hammering on about aid, because we've got to hold the Israelis to their promise to flood Gaza with aid, but also saying when it comes to the conflict and the way they're fighting the conflict, they must align with international humanitarian law, because that is the right thing to do for a civilized rule of law democracy, but it's also vital for us because if they don't comply with humanitarian law, particularly in the way that weapons are used, then that would put us in a different situation. So that's the situation there. On defence, on the last 14 years, Britain never slipped below 2%. We were a 2% nation all of the time I was Prime Minister and beyond. And I would argue that, look, I'm delighted when I go up to 2.5%. Great leadership from the Prime Minister, completely right decision to make. But I would make the argument, when I came in 2010, we had to make some difficult decisions, not just on the spending, which we did, and there's no national security without economic security, and that we had to deliver. But I'd also argue we made some quite specific decisions and choices on defence, which were painful, but they were right because they enabled us to completely refresh Britain's defence posture and our equipment. During my time, effectively, we delivered 2 aircraft carriers, the Type 23s, the Type 45s, the Joint Strike Fighters, the Typhoon aircraft, the A400Ms, the C-17s from America, the new Chinooks, a whole lot of new equipment for our army. There's a massive change in what we actually delivered. And that was partly because we did make some difficult decisions. I mean, it was agony to have a gap when we didn't have an aircraft carrier. It was agony to say that we had to say goodbye to the Sea Harriers. It was very difficult to say we weren't going to be able to continue with Nimrod, but we made choices that put us in a position that we can thoroughly modernise our defence forces. And now we're in a position where consistent 2%, now moving to 2.5%, and we can use that as a great argument with our friends and allies to say, we've been able to do it, you can do it too. And we're not the only ones. You've got, I was with the Lithuanian Foreign Minister yesterday, he's a 2.7% nation. The Poles are going further. So we've got allies in this fight, and we should have it. Is it part of the political dialogue? Well, that's very much up to the opposition party. Labour have not matched the 2.5%, so there's going to be a very clear choice at the election. If you're worried about a dangerous world, if you want Britain to have strong defences, if you want a government that's absolutely committed to it and set out a timetable, here's the guys with the plan. And if you want a bunch of people who've got no plan, got no idea, then it's a very different case from the Labour Party. With that, I make one point, as I've got the stage, I suppose. I thought yesterday was interesting. Sometimes in politics, a small thing happens, which I think sort of suddenly shines a light in a much bigger way. And I'm not saying the Member of Parliament for Dover is a small thing, but suddenly I think you can see, like, what does this tell us about the party she's joining? In life, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything. And I thought that's sort of what yesterday showed, that there isn't a plan, there isn't a policy about anything. It's just been about clearing the decks to try and focus attention on the governing party. And I think yesterday proved, hold on, if you're going to fall for that, then you really stand for nothing. No plan, policies, no idea, nothing apart from a sort of hope that if everyone can remember how difficult things were 2 years ago or 3 years ago, that they'll troop through the voting lobbies on your side. And when you get close to an election, it stops being a referendum on the government party and it starts being a choice between two parties. And I thought yesterday, if you wake up and hear about a defection, you think, oh no, not another one, how are we going to handle this? By the end of the day, it was like, that says so much more about Keir Starmer and the Labour Party and the complete lack of a plan than it does about a Prime Minister who's a good man doing a great job at a difficult time. But I think increasingly people will see that. On that note, thank you very much for coming. Thank you to NCSB for hosting us, and I look forward to many such more occasions in the future. Thank you very much indeed.